I'm somewhat abashed to appear in front of you. On the other hand, I have been thinking for some years, rather generally, about certain themes in political theory, which I came to think were very relevant to the question of Britain's relationship to the EU, and then, of course, relevant to the actual Brexit debate. So I'd like just to share those thoughts with you. And thank you again very much for the invitation. One of my favourite political quotations, which I'm sure many of you know, is the observation by Lord Melbourne on the failure of the Catholic Emancipation Act to improve the conditions of Irish Catholics. What all the wise men promised has not happened, and what all the damned fools said would happen has come to pass. Well, the damned fools scored an even greater triumph with the Brexit vote. I count myself among them, not in the sense that I predicted the result. Like most people in any profession, I assume that my colleagues, in this case the empiricist political scientists, the wise men of our time, knew what they were doing, but in the sense that I could see the appeal of Brexit to a much greater part of the electorate than seemed to many people to be the case before the referendum. In an article published in the American journal Dissent in May last year that Dean mentioned, and in some follow-up pieces, mostly in America, I argued that the left wing of British politics would benefit significantly from Brexit. Actually, though I didn't say this explicitly then, even more than the right would do. And this was for two reasons. And again, the first Dean has just touched on. The first reason is what you might call purely tactical, the issue of Scottish independence. The Labour Party, as we all know, has virtually never won a general election purely on English votes. England is, and almost always has been, in many ways, a fundamentally Tory country. You might say it goes back almost to the problems of the 1650s and the fear of having a new general election, even in those years, because the revolutionaries would lose. So the prospect of a left-wing party re-establishing itself in England depends on a continuation of the Union. And, I argued, it was the EU which had undermined the British Union, unwittingly, I'm not saying this is a conspiracy, but objectively speaking, it undermined it by offering the Scots a largely costless path to independence. Almost everything which the Act of Union had guaranteed to Scotland as an economy integrated with England was equally guaranteed to it by the European Union. The exception might be an integrated currency, but as we saw in the Scottish referendum debate, that was a very debatable question. And of course, you probably know, the SNP itself realised this, partly under the influence of Jim Sillars, ironically enough, in the mid-1980s, and its dramatic change of policy on the common market, to which before then it had been deeply hostile, was, I think, the prelude to its electoral success. I mean, the mid-83, or more or less then, when it switched, represented the beginning of the rise in Scottish popularity of the SNP. I grew up in Newcastle, as you can tell from my accent, and I remember the days when mostly what the SNP did was move the Welcome to Scotland sign from one side of Berwick-upon-Tweed to the other. But after the mid-80s, with this new position about the EU, it changed dramatically. But Scottish independence was only costless in this fashion if both countries remained in the EU. Even if an independent Scotland could remain in the EU after England had left, something the SNP leaders often fantasize about, the costs of disunion for the Scots would escalate dramatically, both economically and, as importantly, psychically. So Brexit, I claimed, was likely to stall the movement towards independence in Scotland. The second reason that I thought Brexit would help the left was more fundamental. It was that the essential character of the EU has become, as Wolfgang Streeck in particular has powerfully argued, hostile to traditional socialism of the mid-20th century variety. It is, incidentally, I think, testimony to the remarkably impoverished nature of the British debate on the EU, that I think it's failed to generate any analysis of comparable seriousness and sophistication to that found on the continent, particularly, I would say, in the writings of Streeck, Habermas, who, of course, is very much opposed to Streeck, and Varoufakis, except perhaps in the work of Chris Bickerton at Cambridge. If Britain left the EU, I argued, the space available to left-wing policies would suddenly expand, and all sorts of possibilities, including such things as thoroughgoing nationalisation or renationalisation, or differential regional taxes, would be on the table again. And I'll return to this issue in much more detail in the last part of this lecture. I should perhaps say that just after the Brexit vote, the Centre for European Studies at Harvard organised a little sort of symposium in which I was asked to more or less say what I had been saying. And my opponent was someone you probably know, or many of you will know, which was Radek Sikorski, former Foreign Minister of Poland. I went first, and I did my usual thing about how the common market, or the EU, the common market began and the EU has remained in many ways inimical to traditional socialism, and it helps to basically entrench as a certain kind of neoliberal economics. Sikorski, when it was his turn, said, "I agree with absolutely everything that Professor Tuck has said, and that is why I support the EU." So it was a very neat little thing. So those were my two reasons before the referendum took place for thinking that the left should take the possibility of Brexit, to say the least, very much more serious than it seemed to be doing. But I didn't expect I would see these effects that I predicted so quickly. I think the presumption that Brexit would now take place played a major part in the recent general election. In Scotland, it must surely have helped to turn the tide, to the degree it did, against the SNP, making a significant number of people recoil from the idea of a Scotland detached from England under the new circumstances. This is incidentally entirely compatible with the way Scots voted in the Brexit referendum. There was every reason for Scots who sympathise with independence to vote Remain in a UK-wide poll. I'd have done the same myself. I mean, I should say, I have quite a lot of sympathy with Scottish independence, so that when I talk about this, I'm talking, as I said, purely in a sense tactically from the point of view of the left overall in the British Isles. There was every reason for Scots who sympathise with independence to vote Remain in a UK-wide poll, but that's very different from voting for an independent Scotland to stay in the EU separately from England, though the SNP leadership, naturally enough, have conflated the two things. And in England, or the rest of UK, Jeremy Corbyn felt able to put forward a manifesto which not only, I think, fairly clearly endorsed leaving the EU, more clearly than some people are now claiming, since it promised an end to the free movement of labour, something incompatible with the single market, and the creation of new trade agreements with the rest of the world, which, as we all know, is incompatible with the customs union. But it also included policies which would have seemed mainstream for the Labour Party during the 30 years after the war, the Trente Glorieuses, as Thomas Piketty has labelled those 3 decades in post-war history, but which would, at the very least, be hard to implement within the EU as currently configured. And again, I'll come back to that in more detail. And it was these policies, or at least, I think perhaps as importantly, the attitude which underpinned them, the willingness to think in this new way, or to think in this old way, revived way, which I think most people agree produced a new kind of, and surprising kind, of enthusiasm for the Labour Party. A corollary of this was the complete implosion of UKIP. In the months after the US election last November, I often found myself arguing against people in America who thought that Trump and Brexit were the same phenomenon. On my view, Brexit was in fact an inoculation against Trump and the politics of the radical right. Leaving the EU would not only kill Scottish independence, fairly straightforward, it would also kill the kind of right-wing politics in England which UKIP represented, since it was largely driven, I think, and I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, by a sense of powerlessness, fundamentally driven by a sense of powerlessness. The feeling, and it need be no more than a feeling, that the political process could, after all, be responsive to what people wanted, even on fundamental matters, would immediately remove the emotional force from the radical right's message. And that, too, duly seems to have happened. Compare UKIP's performance in the election with Trump's in his election, or with Marine Le Pen's. I mean, you know, we know Macron won, but at what cost in terms of abstentions and opposition? Or the radical right's performance in almost any Western country today. I began to think that as in the 1930s, Britain may have dodged the bullet of a kind of fascism, and largely because its political structures once again permit, rather than constrain, radical politics. This is a lesson which needs to be learned more widely. The more one attempts to use constitutional or cultural power, these being largely the same things, to suppress dangerous and distasteful political movements, the stronger they grow. for the members of the movements now possess a justifiable case against their rulers. Related to this is what I think is a widespread misunderstanding. This is a tricky area, and we may debate about this later. But related to this is what I think is a widespread misunderstanding about the role immigration from the EU played in the referendum. The general right of EU citizens to come to Britain is a very clear example of powerlessness on the part of the British authorities. There are many other examples, as we shall see, which to a liberal on immigration like myself are more important. But it is perhaps the most visible and concrete case. And we have carefully and responsibly to distinguish between a general hostility to immigrants and the desire to have an immigration policy. It is, I think, quite strictly parallel, at least I hope this is true, on both sides of the Atlantic. It is quite strictly parallel to the hostility to illegal immigration in the US. The two things are similar because in the US it's illegal, which illustrates that the state can do nothing about it, the government can do nothing about it. In Britain, of course, it's legal, but it's still the case that under that structure of law, the British state can do nothing about it. It is, to my mind, anxiety about its illegality in the US, and the fact that certain kinds of liberals don't seem to care about this, which angers many people, since it too is an example of the ordinary political processes ceasing to have any effect. I don't see in the US, though again I may be naive here, any desire, for example, to repeal the 1965 Immigration Act, which removed racial quotas from the US immigration system. And one might expect at least some move in that direction if there was a genuine revival there of pre-1965 racism in immigration matters. And one shouldn't forget that the same voters who voted for Trump, in many cases 4 years earlier, had voted for a black president. In this respect, I think both Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, despite their very great difference in other ways, both of whom I think want a generous immigration policy after Brexit, may have a better instinct about British public opinion than the people who simply accuse the British voters of racism. Though one can see why that accusation is a very useful one to make for opponents of leave, and I would probably do it myself if I was on that side. However, the weeks after the general election have seen signs of a retreat from the clarity offered by the Brexit vote. Remainers, particularly of a familiar world-weary sort, say that this is because the clarity was an illusion and the full implications of Brexit are only now dawning. But to think this is essentially, I think, to make the same mistake which British politicians, and to some degree the whole of British society, have always made about the character of the EU. It is to confuse what one might call policy, matters of policy, with matters of constitutional principle. The vote in the referendum was a very unusual thing in this country. It was a vote on a constitutional issue. And questions of policy have now to be decided within this new framework. Though the framework allows a very wide range of options, and indeed the striking and unusual fact about the vote is that it was a vote to put in place a less restrictive constitutional framework than has been the case since 1973. The British have always shied away from considerations of constitutional structures, apart from a familiar type of crank with over-detailed schemes for electoral reform and so on. But the EU has to be thought about in these terms. To adapt Trotsky's thought on the dialectic, you may not be interested in constitutions, but constitutions are interested in you. This is something which is easier for Britons to see if they think about the USA. They're used to understanding American politics against the background of the Constitution, partly because Americans famously keep emphasizing that themselves, with oaths of loyalty to the Constitution and so on. And they're familiar with the idea that a critical issue in a presidential election is the ability to determine political outcomes for a generation via the appointment of justices to the Supreme Court. But close to 700 years of a very different kind of political system. I say 700 years since I think the essential principles of parliamentary legislation and taxation were largely the creation of Edward III in order to fight the 100 Years' War with public support. This history has left the British with very different instincts about their own politics. So deeply imbued have we been with the idea that Parliament, and therefore general elections, can in principle change any features of our common life, that the argument about the EU has almost entirely been an argument about what kind of policies we want to pursue at the moment. The most striking feature of the referendum debate itself, I thought, was that it was to a great extent conducted as if it was a normal British general election, in which matters of policy were to be decided for the next 5 years or so. The argument about levels of immigration, which came to dominate the debate, at least in some quarters, exemplified this. It was largely concerned with the desirability or otherwise of specific numbers or types of immigrant, as if what was at stake was the British government's immigration policy over the next few years. I was even told explicitly by a number of anti-Brexit friends that what mattered was preventing a Tory victory in the referendum, and the issues that were in debate could all be sorted out later. This approach was reassuring, in a way, since it showed that at an instinctive level the British still thought of politics as something which was open to change at the ballot box. But in this particular setting, the old instincts proved to be an impediment to clear thinking about the issues. For some years before the referendum, I'd been trying to get clear in my own mind how to theorize the US Constitution. And I came to think that Britain's relationship with the EU made sense, rather surprisingly, in somewhat similar terms. I tried to explain the general approach in lectures which I delivered at Cambridge in 2012, which subsequently appeared as a book called The Sleeping Sovereign in 2016. I didn't discuss the EU directly in those lectures, but it was already at the back of my mind, and my dissent piece drew on the thoughts that I'd had 4 years earlier. Briefly, what I argued was that we should take seriously the distinction which some major 17th and 18th century political theorists drew between sovereignty and government. For hundreds of years, it had been assumed that democracy of the ancient kind was impossible in a modern state, since the population couldn't meet to deliberate in a nation the size of France or England. All that might be possible was a system of representation, hailed as the great modern, that is, of course, medieval, invention by 18th century historians. But that wasn't democracy in the ancient or the natural sense of the term, in which the people legislate. Aristotle, for example, had described election as an aristocratic principle, since it picked out a limited set of legislators. What 18th century theorists realized, above all Rousseau, but many of the American founders as well, was that popular legislation on fundamental matters is not impeded by the size or character of a modern state. Government, to use their term, had to be conducted by small groups or even a single person, able to deliberate and devote all their time to the issues. But sovereignty could be expressed in the occasional creation or amendment of fundamental laws which would form a constitution. The referendum naturally followed as a means of occasional popular legislation on constitutional matters. The very first one in the world, most people don't know this, not being in Switzerland or anywhere like that, but being in Massachusetts, in my state, in America, in 1778, when the new constitution of the independent state was put to the vote of all the citizens. It should be said they threw it out, largely because the Constitution contained a provision about the privileges of Harvard. So they put it to them again, and they passed it the second time. Other American states followed suit, and even the federal Constitution, though not put to a referendum, though there have been some, there's one very influential jurist in America, Akhil Amar, who thinks that if there were to be a thoroughgoing revision of the American Constitution, it now would have to be put to a plebiscite. Even the federal Constitution, though not put to a referendum, was designed to be ratified in a series of popular assemblies. Revolutionary France then embarked on the most extensive experiment with constitutional referendums. And though they fell into abeyance after the Revolution, interest in constitutional referendums revived in the late 19th century and again after the Second World War, until they are the norm in almost all European countries and in all but one of the states of the USA. Once the distinction between an act of sovereignty and an act of government was in place, it might be possible to assign the role of constitutional legislator to non-democratic institutions as well. In fact, the two earliest theorists of the distinction, Hobbes and Jean Baudin, assigned it to monarchs. But the distinction was always more relevant to democracy than to any other system of fundamental legislation, for the obvious reason that a monarch or a board of aristocrats is not impeded in exercising acts of government as well as acts of sovereignty. Parliament, for example, can do that. Both Baudin and Hobbes seem actually to have understood this. Britain historically had kept out of this story, retaining its medieval representative institution and treating what elsewhere would be constitutional laws, passed in a special way, as merely ordinary statutes. Instead, it's often said that Britain has an unwritten constitution and the US a written one. This isn't really true. There are many constitutional conventions in the US, as it have to be. I mean, you can't run a state entirely on the basis of written principles. My favourite is that it's quite compatible with the US Constitution for the same person to be governor of every state in the Union. And think what power that person would have, right? But it's a convention, no more than a convention, that you don't do that. No one does that. No one tries to run for governor in every state. That's a historically appropriate analogy, incidentally, because that was the role of the stadtholder, the Princes of Orange, in the United Provinces. They happened to be the stadtholder, the same person, the stadtholder of 6 out of the 7 provinces. There are constitutional conventions in the US, and there are written laws which are patently constitutional in the UK, such as the Act of Settlement, the Act of Union, and the accession to the European Communities Act. The difference is not whether the rules are written or unwritten, but who does the writing, and whether they are a different and more democratic body than the one which writes the ordinary legislation of the country. But accession to the EU changed this. So the right way to theorise the EU, I have argued, is as in effect a coordinated set of constitutional structures for each of the member countries. The EU is not a superstate, nor can it easily become one juridically. It's always been clearly stated by the highest legal authorities in each country that at least at the moment the countries are the sovereign entities, able in the last resort to decide their own futures. This is not empty rhetoric, since among other things it is the justification for the continued representation of each EU country separately at the UN, something they're extremely unlikely ever to renounce. For this reason, I think much of the use of the term sovereignty in the referendum debate was indeed as unhelpful as its critics complain. Moreover, the fact that the EU is not a state is the source of many of the problems it itself faces, as well as the problems conventional states face dealing with it. The thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean, a testimony to the dangers of its current anomalous character, and the fact that it is stuck in a halfway house, neither able to be a state with its own borders, nor an alliance of states which control their own. It's also why negotiating with it is not like negotiating with a normal state, but more, you might say in some ways, though one shouldn't push this analogy too far, more like negotiating with the Supreme Court. The picture that Varoufakis has painted in his gripping memoirs of his dealings with the EU institutions illustrates their strange character, and the mistake we make if we treat it like either a unitary state or an ordinary international grouping, NATO or something. The key feature of the EU is that the sovereign authority in each state has enacted a certain rather curious kind of constitutional order for each of them, in which a set of principles and institutions are entrenched in a position beyond the reach of conventional governmental legislation. These principles and institutions are supranational in character, of course, and it's why the states took this course of action. But seen from within each state, the supranational character is not in a way the key feature. The key feature is rather that they're entrenched within the legal system of each country. That's what makes them different from the other supranational arrangements with which they're often compared, such as NATO or even the UN, at least in great part. The curious feature of these constitutional orders, however, is that they can't be amended by the same process by which they were imposed. An act of the UK Parliament by itself straightforwardly entrenched the EU institutions in UK law, but no act of the UK Parliament by itself can amend them. Only a process of intergovernmental negotiation, issuing in changes which no one country can impose upon itself, can alter the essential character of the EU's constitutional structure. The only thing an individual state can do is repudiate the whole structure, as we are finding out. Now, of course, most states on the continent already had constitutional structures of some sort of this kind before the EU was formed, and their politicians were used to operating inside them, just as American politicians are. But the idea that a constitution couldn't be amended was new to them also, though, and this may be significant, not to German politicians. The German constitution is a legal oddity. The West German constitution, the Grundgesetz, was technically authorized by 3 of the 4 powers in the Allied military government, and included the provision that in the event of reunification, a new constitution would have to be ratified by the German people. After the dissolution of the military government in 1991, the provinces of East Germany simply acceded to the Western state and to its Grundgesetz. So the German constitution has never actually been ratified properly, and some Germans think, particularly those who were in the East, think that it is fundamentally illegitimate as a result. Moreover, a tradition has developed within German constitutional jurisprudence of supposing that certain fundamental moral principles are enshrined in constitutional law without the need for positive enactment. It's easy to see how a domestic structure of this kind renders the structures of the EU far less problematic for Germany than they are for the UK, or indeed for France, with its very long and very important history of popular constitutional legislation. People talk a lot of nonsense, I think, about the undemocratic character of France. France is the home of democracy, as we know, and its recent history is in a way, a strange episode in this history. Britain, by virtue of its desire to join what was then the common market, thus found itself forced unwittingly into what you might call the default shape of a modern state, with a constitution which lay beyond the power of the government to change. And as an almost instinctive recognition of this, the Wilson administration, as we all know, decided to use for the first time the default institution of constitutional legislation in a modern state, the referendum, in order to legitimate it. Though constitutional referendums had occasionally been proposed in the UK, notably to deal with Irish and actually Scottish, we've tended to forget, a Scottish Home Rule before the First World War. This was the first time that such a thing had seemed clearly necessary in Britain, about 200 years after it had seemed equally clearly necessary to the English settlers in Massachusetts. Since that time, as we also all know, the constitutional referendum has become a familiar feature of British political life. Characteristically, this has happened without a formal or legal acknowledgement of their fundamental role, and technically they are merely consultative. But the idea that they could be disregarded seems to most people about as fanciful as the idea that the Queen could actually use the power still technically in her hands to veto a parliamentary statute. Even in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, few people have advocated simply ignoring the result. The popular anti-Brexit response has been instead to call for a second vote, and that seems to me to be testimony to the obviousness of the change that has come over British politics. The EU and the referendum as an institution in the UK are wrapped in one another's arms. They go together. I might add at this point the dangers and disadvantages of these sort of constitutional structures tend to be far less obvious to people who are politically engaged or have some kind of public role. I mix in America with people who are regularly dealing with the Supreme Court, many of my colleagues at Harvard. They're leading figures in political parties, or they're writing for the press and trying to influence the political agenda. For them, it's easier to think that they will have some effect on politics through these processes than through the old-fashioned processes of election, and they're probably right. And it's natural for them to think that their personal experience in this area is something like an objective fact. One of the critical comments on my Brexit piece concluded with something like, perhaps we have had too much democracy. It struck me reading it that we wouldn't have to worry about less democracy if we were people like you and me, but for most people, the vote is the one way they possess of altering their political circumstances. And as a result, I think the general population has always been able to think more clearly about the EU than the political elites, since they have much more to lose in this respect. To repeat, you may not be interested in constitutions, but constitutions are interested in you. They are not neutral, benign forces, however much the lawyers charged with maintaining them pretend that this is so. Again, you only have to think about the history of American constitutional jurisprudence, much more familiar to us than continental constitutional jurisprudence, and that itself is a revealing fact, to see this. Think about the way the Commerce Clause has been used to extend federal power. Think about the Dred Scott judgment and its endorsement of slavery. Think about the Korematsu case on the internment of Japanese Americans. Think about Citizens United. Put against them, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education, Roe versus Wade. But we'll be choosing according to our political preferences. Certain kinds of political programs are simply impossible in certain kinds of constitutional orders. My favorite example of this, something of great relevance to the general theme of this lecture, is the creation of the National Health Service in Britain. It required a very unusual constitutional order. since its most distinctive feature, and the thing which still sharply differentiates it from the single-payer systems found in most developed countries, and even in many respects one should say the US, because actually, as you probably know, the federal government in the US spends more per capita on healthcare in the US than the British government does. That's because of Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, the Veterans Administration. And of course, the old are covered by both Medicare and Medicaid, actually, and of course they are the main consumers of healthcare. But anyway, the thing which sharply differentiates the NHS from these other systems was the fact that it involved a mass expropriation of private property in the form of the so-called voluntary hospitals, some which, like Bart's, had been independent institutions for over 800 years. This was the issue which was most fiercely debated within the Attlee cabinet. And the result of Nye Bevan's victory there was one of the most far-reaching examples of nationalisation from those years, and the only one which has survived more or less intact. It's often asked by opponents of the NHS, if it's so good, why don't other countries copy it? But in this respect, it would be extremely difficult for other countries to copy it, since in most modern states, expropriation of private property without compensation would be legally impossible, without a far-reaching constitutional amendment which might be very hard to pass. In Britain in 1946, all that was needed was a single sentence in an Act of Parliament. There shall on the appointed day be transferred to invest in the minister by virtue of this Act all interests in or attaching to premises forming part of a voluntary hospital or used for the purposes of a voluntary hospital. That's all it takes to create the NHS. There's lots of other stuff, but that's the key clause. What this illustrates is that the achievements of the Attlee government, still the touchstone for left-wing measures in this country, required the kind of ancient omnicompetence, as it used to be called, which Parliament still possessed in the 1940s. The fact that every schoolchild is taught, are they still, I guess, that the British Labour movement was intensely parliamentary and non-revolutionary, wasn't the consequence of some magic trait of the British, which enabled them to avoid the turmoils of the revolutionary years on the continent, and indeed in America, for what else was the Civil War but a vast revolutionary movement. Marx and Engels observed from their vantage point in Victorian England that the bourgeoisie had taken different routes in France and England to hamper the industrial working class from gaining power. In France, they'd conceded universal male suffrage, first in 1792, and again, and for good, in 1848, but they had bound the legislature, elected by universal suffrage, with a constitution which secured things such as private property, broadly defined, against legislative encroachment. In England, there were no such constraints on the legislature, observed Marx and Engels, and therefore the proletariat had to be denied the vote, which in this country, we should remember, was finally extended to the entire adult male population only in 1918, the same year that the first women received it, or rather recovered it, since women lost the vote in 1832, as many of you probably know. So Marx and Engels concluded that the only thing necessary to bring about socialism in England was the extension of the parliamentary franchise, whereas in France it required revolutionary and extra-constitutional action. Exactly the same logic activated the early leaders of the Labour Party in Britain, who I think actually were more Marxist than we often think. Anyway, but I mean, they would have come to the same conclusion. They had every confidence that the parliamentary route to power was the right one, since then they would have available to them any measures to promote socialism which they thought fit, and which they could persuade a simple majority of their country, by definition largely the working class, to support. Now, in the case of the EU, the overall character of the constitutional order pushes consistently in what we might call, though I don't terribly like the term, a neoliberal direction. This is Radek-Sikorski's view. This is the point which Wolfgang Streeck has repeatedly insisted on and has documented in convincing detail. He thinks it's largely because of the influence on the institutions of German capital. And that's clearly true to an extent. But I will also argue that the institutions, to some degree, have a life of their own. Put in place a constitutional order which specifies certain economic freedoms, for the EU, the now notorious four freedoms, the free movement of goods, capital, services, and labour, to which we should also add the lesser-known but very important freedom of establishment. I'll mention that presently. Let a group of modern jurists loose on them, and the result will almost inevitably be a series of rules which objectively are tilted towards the market. Constitutional orders are a combination of rules and the people who interpret them, as Hobbes, of course, understood very well. And the people concerned inevitably develop a certain kind of internal culture which is usually proudly immune to outside political pressures. The American founders realized this and were very interested in ways in which the judicial process could be made responsible to the citizens, including in some states the election of judges and the whole elaborate process of nomination and confirmation for federal judges, including, of course, the Supreme Court justices. The worst of all worlds, I will say provocatively, is to have a strong constitutional order and an independent judiciary, something I sometimes fear Britain is drifting towards even outside the EU, but that would be material for another day. A simple way of seeing how this works is a comparison between Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. As many people have observed, the parallels between them are very close in terms of their age, their lack of conventional politicians' gloss, their roles as insurgents within an established centre-left party, and the enthusiastic support they receive from young voters. The three proposals which Sanders put at the heart of his movement were pull out of or radically modify NAFTA and do not enter the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, greatly increase the tax on the big Wall Street banks, and introduce free state college and university tuition, paid for largely by the Wall Street tax. The British version of these proposals obviously resonated with Labour's newly energised electorate, but, and I want to stress this, none of them would be feasible for a British government within the EU. The EU is itself, or was itself, Britain's NAFTA or TPP, and it decided all questions of trade for Britain with the rest of the world, so there'd be no question of a British Bernie within the EU even thinking of such a thing. A British government could theoretically change the tax regime on the city, but the free movement of labour and capital within the EU would permit the banks simply to transfer operations to a friendlier tax regime elsewhere in the Union, without anything of the trauma which would afflict Wall Street banks if they fled the US to avoid a Bernie tax. And even something one would have thought as parochial as free college tuition would not have been entered into lightly by a Britain within the EU. The EU enforces the principle that no distinction can be made between home and EU students when it comes to college fees. So free tuition funded by British taxes for British students, assuming the banks could be made to stand still long enough to be taxed, would mean free tuition for students from across the EU funded by the British. Scotland has managed this on a small scale, though with a significant anomaly that it can charge fees to English students but not to other EU ones. I don't know how many of you realise that. It's very bizarre. Though, I mean, if it couldn't do that, I think it wouldn't work, the system wouldn't work at all. But it's inconceivable, I think, that a scheme of this kind could be put in place for the whole of Britain without enormous public protest. I should say that I'm amazed that the tabloids didn't leap long ago onto the fact that British taxpayers already subsidise EU students in English universities, far more in practice than other EU taxpayers subsidise British students at continental universities. Strikingly, the EU enforces a rule which even in the much more integrated economy of the US would be unacceptable, since it is taken for granted there that in-state students pay lower fees at state universities than out-of-state ones. If what I've been saying so far is right, the worst mistake which the left in Britain could make would be once again to put itself under these kinds of constraint. Paradoxically, or perhaps not paradoxically, the constraints don't affect the right anything like as much. Indeed, I would say the underlying, and this is Sikorsky's point to me in our debate in Harvard, I would say the underlying verities of the EU are currently just the same as they were in the 1970s, when Margaret Thatcher wore her famous common market dress, and a wide swathe of Labour politicians, from Michael Foot through Tony Benn, who in those days was not thought to be exceptionally left-wing, to Peter Shaw, who was generally on the right of the party, all saw the risks to traditional Labour politics which European Union posed. This is, I think, why Corbyn, a relic like myself from the 1970s, could see this more clearly than other contemporary politicians. This particular penny is beginning to drop on the right. I was very struck by a recent piece in The Telegraph by Charles Moore, raising the question of whether it might be best to stay within the institutions of the EU in order to block Corbyn's policies. To his credit, he answered his own question decisively in the negative, but his article reminds us about the odd history of European Union and how its critical aspect has always been the role of union in removing possibilities from domestic politics, though this has seldom been possible for the political parties to admit, even to themselves. I think it's reasonable to say that the Tories were enthusiastic about it as a means of permanently blocking the reappearance of socialism, to start with, but turned against it when it looked under Delors as if it would instead entrench left-wing policies. Labour became interested in it at that point, but began to turn against it recently when it turned out that the actual decisions of the European institutions, by and large, go against the interests of European workers. It should also be said that there's always been a significant section of the Labour Party which viewed membership as a kind of self-denying ordinance, preventing the party from veering back to the left, and therefore, they thought, endangering its electoral prospects. This is, I think, the honourable, though I would say misguided, source of the strange fascination it's held for some important figures in the party. But the key point about this history is it's precisely the capacity of the European Union to take serious political issues off the domestic agenda that has been the fundamental reason both for supporting it and for opposing it. Dean mentioned Noel Malcolm, a mutual friend of Noel's and mine, a man called Eric Nelson, who's a colleague of mine at Harvard, came to England just before the vote, and had dinner with Noel one evening and then lunch with me the following day. And he observed, with a great deal of humour, that Noel had spent the dinner telling him that the trouble with the EU is that it's this structure which forces socialism upon Europe, and I spent the lunch telling him that it's a structure that forces neoliberal economics upon Europe. But of course the difference is, depending which point you sort of stopped tracking what is going on in the character of the Union, the fundamental point that it blocks things was common ground for both Noel and me, despite our very different political attitudes. So what should the left now do? There's been a remarkable outburst in the press and at Westminster of people trying to engineer a soft Brexit. Astonishingly, the idea seems to have gained ground in some quarters that the Labour vote was a vote against Brexit. This is an idea that could only occur to people in the left establishment who believe that in reality most Labour Party voters must be just like them, and for some reason were merely pretending to be in favour of Brexit last year. This is testimony to the extraordinary power of the conviction among most politically active people that to be on the left simply entails support for the EU, and that sooner or later everyone will realise this. It's also, I think, testimony to the social gulf between the left establishment and its traditional electorate. In particular, something like membership of the EEA is creeping back onto the agenda. At the beginning of the referendum campaign, like many Brexiteers or Lexiteers at that time, I was mildly in favour of the EEA option, and the morning after the vote, I remained fairly keen in the sense that, the vote was not overwhelming and the country ought to be in some way kept more or less united, and that might be the way to do it. And that's clearly not at all a crazy view, I think. But I have come to realise its dangers. First, from the point of view of keeping Scotland in the Union, going back to that technical issue, it's not really an improvement on the EU. Scotland would still not need the United Kingdom to have a united economy with England. And the logic of that position would sooner or later work itself out. Norway, after all, manages to have an integrated economy with the rest of Scandinavia without being under Danish rule. This is presumably why Nicola Sturgeon seems reasonably happy with a soft Brexit. Ruth Davidson is also supposedly pushing for it. This could simply be a piece of local political tactics, but she might mean it. And if so, she may not so easily be able to see off the next push for independence. Indeed, she might easily find herself in a few years' time Prime Minister of an independent Scotland, and who knows whether this has occurred to her or not. Second, the arguments about the restrictions on left policies which the EU institutions represent apply just as much to the EEA or EFTA. By now, the laws in EEA and EFTA countries on such things as competition are thoroughly integrated into the EU legal framework and are governed by ECJ judgments. As long as this is so, the EEA and EFTA will have broadly the same economic character as the EU. This has already been seen in Norway, where a collective agreement dating from the 1970s, which granted the Norwegian Dock Labourers Union the sole right to unload cargo, was nullified by the Norwegian Supreme Court earlier this year on the grounds of its incompatibility with EU law by virtue of the Freedom of Establishment Clause. A Danish shipping company wanted to use its own employees on the docks in Norway to unload the cargo from its ships, and the Norwegian dock workers boycotted the Danish ships, claiming correctly on the face of it that this violated the 1970s agreement but they lost the court case on the grounds that the freedom of establishment permits any group, any corporate body, not just an individual, to settle and do business in any EU country. And so the Danish shipping company had the legal right to settle in Norway and use its employees, members of its corporate body, to do its work. Breaking the comparable arrangement with dock workers, which the Labour government negotiated in 1947, we should remember, was one of Thatcher's signal achievements. I mean, my point about how, in a way, the objective facts here are much more on the side of the right than the left. And though some defenders of this soft Brexit talk about it as a temporary measure, if there's one safe generalisation in politics, it is that temporary arrangements usually become permanent. If I'm right in supposing that this new surge in left-wing politics is the result of Brexit, it would be suicidal to overturn it. We can see the dangers of doing so very clearly in the case of the working-class UKIP voters, particularly in the north, who, regionally it can be exaggerated, who felt it was now safe to return to Labour. But it's also dangerous, indirectly and in the long term, for the newly energised younger voters of the south. They may, to some degree, support the EU. All the opinion polls show that. But again, objectively, I think, their new energy is a product of Brexit, and not in the sense that it's merely a reaction to it. Like everyone else, they have sensed the opening up of possibilities long denied to them. And even if they want the EU, they surely do not want the return to power of the kind of politician the EU necessarily breeds. I suppose the closest analogue to the position we can reasonably ascribe to them is not Strake's, but Varoufakis's, a hope that somehow the EU can be seized by the forces of the left, coming especially from southern Europe. As I said earlier, I think the views of both Strake and Varoufakis are way beyond anything available in the British debate about Europe in their seriousness and sophistication. But the problem with Varoufakis's position is that he has never given any good reason for supposing that his vision is attainable. The more sober view espoused by Strake carries much more conviction, and its lesson, as he himself has acknowledged, is that Brexit may be the best hope not only for Britain but for the rest of Europe as a whole. I should perhaps add at that point that what comes out from that comparison between Strake and Varoufakis is the curious fact that although Brexiteers were often accused, or Lexiteers even more, of being utopian and the Remainers were all realistic, at least from the point of view of the left, I think the opposite is the case. There's a kind of utopianism in Varoufakis, which goes against all the facts. I mean, there is absolutely no reason to suppose that his democratic movement can actually pull off anything like a thoroughgoing reconstruction of the EU. I mean, Macron's not going to do it. I mean, he's going to do a little bit, possibly, but he's not going to do the thoroughgoing thing that Varoufakis wants. And so, in a way, Strake is being realistic in saying we're not going to be able to do that. We've got, in a sense, to use the existing political structures, and Varoufakis is being the utopian in supposing that we should stick with the EU and try and turn it in a left direction. The great prize awaiting the left in Britain, I think, and it's now almost within reach, is genuine Brexit followed by a Labour government. Then the left can reenact whatever it thinks is good in EU regulations about such things as the environment and working conditions, and whatever immigration policy it wishes, and at the same time free itself from the far-reaching restrictions which the EU imposes on traditional socialism. But the Labour Party is clearly faced with a tremendous temptation. Undermine the May government by joining with those in the Conservative Party who want a soft Brexit, and profit from the Conservatives' consequent dissolution. But if the Labour Party chooses short-term success by re-entering in some form these structures, the logic of British politics over the last 30 years will simply repeat itself. I see no reason why it shouldn't. And we will inevitably end up with permanent Tory rule in an England without Scotland, or some kind of Blairite regime, no doubt repackaged, barely, as Macroniste, Macron being the perfect emblem of the conjunction of the EU and neoliberal economic policies and the consequent destruction of socialism. Without Brexit, the Labour Party will revert to its role of providing an alternative managerial class for late-stage capitalism, and the enthusiasm of its newfound supporters will wither away or find new and more troubling outlets. This is exactly what the Tory Remainers would like to see happen, and the Labour leadership ought not to fall into their trap. You in this room will know better than I do whether this will happen, though I should say that, at least as an outsider in this sense, the signs are not good, with Keir Starmer insisting that some deal must be struck with the EU and that a hard Brexit will necessarily be opposed in Parliament by the Labour Party. Above all, I think at the moment the Labour Party needs to keep its nerve. It's on the verge of its greatest prize in a couple of generations, with the possibility of genuinely transforming British politics, and it would be a tragedy if it allowed itself to throw this away. Thank you.